On the night of October 10, sirens began blaring along NATO's easternmost, most vulnerable border, disturbing Europe's sleep, because an unusually large Russian military presence was forming nearby. That day, Russian troops confidently took up positions at the Saatse Butte, a geographical anomaly on the Estonian border, one of NATO's most sensitive points. This was a classic Kremlin move, but within hours, a cold and resolute order from Tallinn led Estonian border guards to seal the Saatse crossing. In fact, it was not just a 900-meter stretch of asphalt that was being sealed off, but all escape routes from the dangerous gamble Vladimir Putin had been playing for the past 2 months. This peculiar and nearly indefensible borderline where Russian territory juts into Estonia like a dagger suddenly became a global flashpoint on the night of October 10th. Kunta Podolski, operations director of the Estonian Police and Border Guard Board, stated, "We detected significantly higher than normal military activity on the other side of the border. We closed the crossing indefinitely to prevent possible provocations and hybrid threats." Podolski's statement laid bare the situation. This cool-headed statement was actually an alarm hidden behind diplomatic language. As confirmed by satellite images and open-source intelligence analysts, units belonging to Russia's 76th Air Assault Division had left their permanent bases in Pskov and begun to amass at this very sensitive point. Russian tanks, armored personnel carriers, and electronic warfare systems were taking up positions just a few hundred meters from NATO territory. The perfection of this operation was far beyond coincidence. It was proof of flawless intelligence. From the moment Russian military units started their engines at their barracks in Pskov, the eyes of Estonia and its allies were on them. NATO spy planes in the sky, such as the RC-135 Rivet Joint, listened in on Russian command communications with signals intelligence, while seismic sensors on the ground and covert patrols deployed along the border reported this unusual activity to the crisis center in Tallinn hours in advance. And Estonia had already closed the Narva border crossing, just 100 kilometers from St. Petersburg, until the war ended. To understand Russia's western border, one must look beyond the lines on the map and see a mentality made up of steel, concrete, and paranoia. The Narva border crossing and the Saatse leg, the two most concrete manifestations of this mentality, were two different weapons Moscow held against NATO. One an obvious threat, the other a hidden dagger. However, the possibility of these gates closing not only renders these weapons ineffective, but also transforms Kaliningrad, Russia's biggest asset in the Baltic, into a bone stuck in Moscow's throat, a strategic death trap. So this was not just a matter of border control, it was a scenario of an empire drowning. Until now, Narva has been a multi-layered weapon for the Kremlin. Economically, it was a lifeline connecting St. Petersburg to Europe, through which billions of dollars in trade flowed. Militarily, it was an attack corridor through which Russian armored units could rapidly invade Estonia in a potential conflict, pinning down NATO forces in the north. The ultimate goal of this plan was to open a lifeline to isolated Kaliningrad by breaching the Suwalki corridor via Belarus in the south, while NATO's attention was focused in the north. But the moment this door closes, the entire equation collapses. If the closure of Narva was a big and noisy strategic blow, the sealing of the Saatse leg with concrete blocks is a silent and deadly dagger plunged into the heart of Russia's hybrid warfare doctrine. This anomalous geographical feature was a secret backdoor used by the Kremlin to infiltrate NATO territory, create instability, and prepare the ground for a larger operation. For Spetsnaz teams, GRU saboteurs, and little green men, this forested terrain was a perfect infiltration route to undermine NATO's nervous system from within. The moment this door is sealed, Russia's asymmetric advantage is completely gone. Covert infiltrations, low-intensity provocations, or sudden sabotage raids become impossible. So why did the Estonian government suddenly decide to close this border crossing at 3 a.m? It was the final move in a 60-day war of nerves, stretching from Belarus's hybrid attack in August, which saw thousands of innocent people piled up on the Polish border, to Russian jets roaming the Baltic skies. However, this time the Kremlin's calculations were badly misplaced. It was not facing the timid Europe of 2014. To Poland and Estonia coordinating to paralyze all of Russia's land logistics. Looking at the entire chessboard, it was clear that this move in Saatse was the final and most daring link in a systematic strategy of strangulation and violation that had been ongoing for months, even years. The trap that closed in Saatse on October 10th was actually the inevitable outcome of a geopolitical crisis, a war of nerves that had been escalating for the past 2 months. However, this incident was only the tip of the iceberg. Each move in this deadly chess game was designed as a response to the previous one, drawing Russia step by step into the trap. It began in the summer of 2025, when Belarus, Russia's most loyal ally, ruthlessly dumped thousands of innocent migrants from the Middle East and Africa on the borders of Poland and Lithuania. This was a classic application of the Gerasimov strategy, achieving military and political objectives through non-military means. The aim was threefold. First, to paralyze Poland and Lithuania's border security and create chaos within their domestic public opinion. Second, to create a rift within the European Union and force it to divert its attention and resources from Ukraine to this artificial crisis. Third, and most importantly, to test NATO's resolve and response time. The Kremlin calculated that Brussels and Warsaw would be at a loss as to how to respond to this humanitarian drama, would engage in lengthy discussions, and would ultimately seek some kind of compromise. This was the first step towards softening NATO's eastern flank. NATO saw through this bluff immediately. Instead of weeks of diplomatic chatter, Poland responded with historic resolve. It closed the most critical rail and road border crossings with Belarus indefinitely to all commercial activity. This was not just retaliation, but a strategic shockwave. That day, Russia's and, most importantly, China's main logistical artery for transporting goods to Europe via the new Silk Road was severed with a single stroke. Russia's most important land bridge to the west had been destroyed. This move sent the first clear message to the Kremlin. Your hybrid attacks will now come at a much heavier economic cost. When Russia dismissed Poland's move as a bluff and refused to back down, a second, more painful blow came from the northern part of the chessboard. The Estonian government, in a decision reported by international agencies such as the Moscow Times, announced that the Narva border crossing, the most vital transit point connecting Russia's St. Petersburg to Europe and indirectly to Kaliningrad, would remain closed to all vehicle traffic until the war in Ukraine ended. Poland's blow from the south, combined with Estonia's hammer blow from the north, brought Russia's entire land connection with Europe to the brink of collapse. Logistically strangled, its plans collapsing one by one, and cornered on the chessboard, Russia found recourse in what it knows best: brute force and desperate harassment. However, the most devastating and painful consequence of this chain reaction directly hit Kaliningrad, Russia's stronghold in the Baltic. The dagger plunged into the heart of Europe. The Narva border crossing, Russia's main gateway from St. Petersburg to Europe, which had been closed for months. The closure of this crossing cut off one of the logistical arteries feeding Russia's Kaliningrad stronghold, pushing it into strategic isolation. This strategic region, which had been touted for years as a threat to NATO, suddenly became Russia's greatest weakness, its most vulnerable point. With its land supply routes completely cut off, Kaliningrad was reduced to an island that could only be supplied by sea and air. Considering that the Baltic Sea, with the participation of Sweden and Finland, has effectively become a NATO lake, the riskiness of supplying it by sea is obvious. Estonia's bold move was the final link in the chain supporting the logistical encirclement of Kaliningrad. Putin had pushed Kaliningrad, which he planned to use as a lever to break NATO's flank, into a trap with his own hands. The fortress had now become a prison. At this point, all the pieces on the chessboard fall into place, revealing why Estonia's move is not a simple defense, but a flawless strategic checkmate. With this resolute stance, Estonia has proven to the world that Russia's entire hybrid warfare doctrine and military power, built up over recent years, is nothing but a big bluff and a propaganda bubble. Located right in the heart of Europe, it is a fully militarized region equipped with nuclear-capable Iskander missiles, S-400 air defense systems, and the entire Russian Baltic fleet. This was Putin's biggest trump card against NATO. Without firing a single shot, Poland and Lithuania used a single European Union law to turn Putin's impregnable fortress into an open-air prison overnight. In October 2025, Poland and Lithuania invoked the relevant articles of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, citing persistent hybrid threats and Russia's constant violations of international law. This seemingly technical and bureaucratic move was actually one of the most daring moves ever made against Russia, a nuclear power. With this decision, all road and rail transit through Polish and Lithuanian territory from Russia to Kaliningrad, or from Kaliningrad to Russia, was completely halted for goods subject to EU sanctions. To understand the genius of this operation and the helplessness it created for Russia, it is necessary to first examine in detail the fragile lifelines of Kaliningrad, and then how these lifelines were severed. Under normal circumstances, Kaliningrad's economic and social life breathed through two main land corridors. The Lithuanian corridor was the most vital lifeline. Freight trains from Russian centers such as Pskov and St. Petersburg entered Lithuanian territory via Belarus, passing south of Vilnius to reach Kaliningrad. Almost all heavy cargo such as military equipment, heavy industrial products, coal and grain was transported via this railway line. In the Polish corridor, trucks entering Poland via Belarus passed through the northeast of Warsaw and skirted the strategic Suwałki Gap to reach Kaliningrad. Food, consumer goods, and lighter commercial products generally use this route. These two corridors were the arteries connecting Kaliningrad to Russia. Without these arteries, it would have been impossible to feed Kaliningrad's civilian population of 1 million, resupply its garrison of tens of thousands of soldiers, and keep the Baltic fleet operational. Resupplying by sea and air was both extremely expensive and, in a crisis, a much more militarily vulnerable method. Ukraine's successes against Russian ships in the Black Sea using naval drones had already proven how risky sea-based resupply was. Therefore, Kaliningrad was entirely dependent on these transit routes through the territories of Poland and Lithuania, both NATO and EU members, to survive. However, Poland and Lithuania turned this geographical dependency into a strategic weapon. What they did was not to declare a new blockade. What they did was to strictly enforce the sanctions that the European Union was already imposing on Russia due to the war in Ukraine, also for transit goods passing through their territories. So what did this list of sanctioned goods contain? And what did it mean for Kaliningrad? What does this mean? The land entry of hundreds of products into Kaliningrad is now prohibited, including cement, metal, coal, high-tech products, machine parts, and even luxury consumer goods. This list is so comprehensive that it effectively halts the transit of almost everything that sustains Kaliningrad's military and civilian economy, except for basic human necessities such as food and medicine. The most ingenious aspect of this blockade is the way it is implemented. There are no tanks or soldiers stopping Russian convoys at the border. There are only Polish and Lithuanian customs officers, calmly and professionally doing their jobs, with tablets displaying EU regulations. The process is brutally simple. A train or truck convoy from Russia reaches the border. Customs officers take the cargo manifest and compare each item on the list with the EU's thousands of sanctioned items. If even one wagon or container contains a prohibited product, not just that wagon or truck, but the entire convoy is turned back. There are no exceptions. This is an infuriating bureaucratic nightmare for Russia. There is no military target to retaliate against. There is no act of aggression to complain about. There are only European officials saying, "Sorry, those are the rules." This legal move has taken away Putin's biggest bargaining chip. Kaliningrad has been marketed for years as an access denial/area dominance bubble by Russian propaganda. With the S-400 and Iskander missiles deployed there, it was claimed to have declared a large part of the Baltic Sea and half of Poland off-limits to NATO aircraft and ships. However, this latest move has turned this A2/AD shield into a cage isolating Kaliningrad from the outside world. Those missiles no longer keep NATO out. They trap Russia's Baltic fleet and garrison inside. A strategic asset has suddenly become a massive logistical burden and a trap. But the roots of this tension run much deeper, lying in the digital battlefields of history. In 2007, Estonia became the target of the first full-scale cyber attack in history. Organized by Russia, this attack completely crippled the country's banking system, government offices, and communications infrastructure. It was akin to a digital Pearl Harbor. This trauma was etched into Estonia's DNA, forcing them to build one of the world's most robust cyber defense architectures. This historical wound is a critical key to understanding Estonia's current resolve and level of preparedness. The logistical lockdown imposed in Narva, the terror wrought in the skies, and finally the military buildup in Saatse. None of this was coincidence. All were pieces of the same dark scenario, calculated steps taken by the bear to frighten, isolate, and paralyze its prey before devouring it. But this time the bear would find not a deer, but a porcupine, every quill of which was poisonous. While this standoff was taking place, a massive operation was being carried out in the background. Redirecting civilian traffic to alternative routes in a matter of seconds was not a simple traffic adjustment. It was an operation to completely clear a potential conflict zone of civilian elements, preparing a clean firing range for the Estonian army and the tens of thousands of volunteers behind it. As each civilian vehicle was removed from the area, the final touches were being made to the graves prepared for Russian tanks. Estonia had not only closed its border to Russia, but had also prepared a battlefield of its own choosing, to be played by its own rules. Behind Estonia's unwavering confidence and daring move lies a deadly defense strategy, the hedgehog strategy, meticulously woven over the past decade, combining Western technology with the trauma of Soviet occupation. The spirit of this strategy does not aim to win a conventional war. It has a much more ruthless and clear objective: to turn an invasion into such a bloody, costly, and hellish experience for the invading force that it chokes to death, tearing its own throat apart because of the hedgehog it tried to swallow. The activation of this strategy means that not just an army, but an entire nation has gone to war. The Defense League, consisting of more than 90,000 fully equipped and highly motivated volunteers, cybersecurity experts, local hunting clubs, and even retired soldiers, all integrate into the army at a single command. By allocating more than 3% of its gross domestic product to defense, Estonia has built up an arsenal capable of crippling an army many times its size. What did they buy with that money? American-made M142 HIMARS multiple rocket launchers, which turned Russian tank battalions in Ukraine into scrapyards. Israeli-Singaporean co-produced Blue Spear anti-ship missiles, capable of sending any Russian warship in the Baltic Sea to the bottom of the sea in seconds. And Polish-made Piorun Manpads air defense systems that will wipe Russian attack helicopters and low-flying jets from the sky one by one. These weapons are Estonia's hedgehog spines, each a high-tech deadly antidote designed to neutralize a specific element of Russia's military power. When the Kremlin strategists planned this operation, they had a classic hybrid warfare scenario on the table, one that had worked many times before. The plan was simple: create military tension at the border, spread disinformation using excuses like the safety of ethnic Russians, spark debate within NATO about whether it's worth going to war for this small country, gauge the West's reaction, and ultimately force Estonia to the negotiating table for some kind of compromise. This was a tactic that had worked flawlessly in Georgia, Crimea, and the early years of Donbass. Putin and his generals thought they would find a government that was once again frightened, unsure of what to do, waiting for a phone call from its Western allies. However, these expectations were shattered by the rock-hard reality of Estonia. Putin's greatest mistake was failing to read the spirit of the times. For example, Putin thought he was testing the cowardly and unprepared Ukraine of 2014. But he found a country that had memorized all the lessons Ukraine had learned through blood and tears over the past decade. A country that had become completely immune to Russian tactics and propaganda. Estonia had seen how Russia's invincible army myth got bogged down in the Ukrainian steppes. It had learned how fragile Russian logistics were, how cumbersome their command and control systems were, and most importantly, how a motivated army equipped with Western technology could stop this giant. What it found was not a frightened government, but a fortress that saw its move hours in advance, was ready to respond militarily immediately, and most importantly, had the ironclad nuclear deterrence of NATO's Article 5 behind it. Putin, thinking he was threatening a pawn on the chessboard, failed to realize that he had actually put his own king in front of his opponent's strongest castle. This was not a miscalculation, but a strategic blind spot. Estonia's decision to close the Saatse and Narva border crossings triggered a geographically small but strategically massive domino effect. Although this move appeared to be a single action, when combined with a series of developments that had been ongoing in the region for months, it turned into a full-blown strategic strangulation operation for Russia. With Poland and Lithuania having already largely closed their border crossings with Belarus due to hybrid threats, and now Estonia completely sealing its northern line, Russia's land gates to Europe were effectively locked. The Kremlin's logistics and trade corridors extending westward were suddenly shut down by an iron curtain. This situation created a shockwave not only for Russia's military, but also for its civilian economy, trapping it within its own borders. Accurate intelligence, unwavering determination, and most importantly, technological superiority showed just how cumbersome and predictable this giant bear really is. Russia's escalation threats became meaningless when faced with an opponent that was not afraid. This was a victory not only for Estonia, but for all small NATO countries. This is strategic paralysis. Putin is no longer the one calling the shots. He is now the one helplessly waiting for his opponent's move. There is also a civil resistance and strategic evacuation aspect to this. This is where the evacuation plans come in, meticulously thought out down to the last detail, prepared to save the lives of more than 400,000 civilians living in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These plans are not a panic escape, but rather an operation to clear the battlefield for professionals. The government has mapped and modernized all potential shelters across the country. The evacuation plan is designed to transport the most vulnerable segments of the civilian population to safe areas, while providing maximum freedom of movement to the army and tens of thousands of volunteer resistance fighters left behind. This minimizes the chaos that a Russian attack on civilian targets would create and allows for more organized and effective resistance. This war of nerves, which has been going on for the last 60 days and culminated in the trap that closed in Saatse on October 10th, triggered a geopolitical earthquake that shook the entire European security architecture to its foundations, with effects that were not limited to the Estonian border. The seismic shockwaves created by this crisis are concentrated at two strategic points, creating a new and dangerous reality for both NATO and Russia. Ultimately, the road closed in Saatse is not just a piece of asphalt. It is a geopolitical fault line that is cracking, symbolizing the end of the era of peace in Europe. However, Russia does not face a frightened, cowed, and ready-to-flee nation. Facing it is a 1.3 million-strong hedgehog, armed with the world's most advanced weapons, sworn to turn every inch of its soil into a grave for invaders and every forest into a swamp. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your opinions in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.